Ever been totally, completely sure you were right about something,
Oh, yeah.
only to find out later, maybe embarrassingly, you'd completely missed the point,
Definitely. Or maybe you made one of those snap decisions. Felt right then.
but didn't quite pan out. Yeah, we've all done it. And that's really what we're diving into today.
Right. Because what seems like simple thinking, our own thought process, is actually, well, it's this fascinating dance between different ways our brain works.
Exactly. And to really get a handle on that, we're doing a deep dive into the work of Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate, specifically his landmark book, Thinking Fast and Slow.
It's a hugely influential book.
It really is. So think of this as your shortcut, your way to grasp the core ideas without reading all, 500 pages. Our mission today is basically to pull out the key insights, the stuff you can actually use.
Those aha moments.
Yeah, the things that give you an edge in understanding, how you think and why you make the decisions you do.
We're not doing a book report here. It's about getting you a solid, practical feel for these two systems. Kahneman talks about System 1 and System 2.
Right, how they shape pretty much everything.
Your thoughts, your choices, every single day.
Okay, so let's set the stage. System 1. Think of it like your brain's autopilot. It's fast, intuitive, mostly automatic. Like you see a friend, you instantly know who it is, or you get that gut feeling something's off.
Yeah, no conscious effort needed, really.
Then there's System 2. That's the deliberate one, the effortful thinker.
The one that needs to focus.
Right, the part that kicks in for a tough math problem or when you're really concentrating learning something new.
These two, System 1 and System 2, they're basically the main characters in the story of our minds.
Okay, so let's really dig into how they, interact, or sometimes how they don't. Kahneman calls System 2 a lazy controller. What does that actually mean in practice?
Well, System 2, the one doing the heavy lifting, the deliberate thinking, it actually uses up energy, like real cognitive energy.
Like a muscle getting tired.
Exactly like a muscle. So naturally, it kind of wants to slap off sometimes, conserve resources.
Okay.
Which means it often just lets System 1 take over, even when maybe a bit more critical thought is needed.
So like making a snap judgment based on your gut.
Perfect example. That's often System 1 jumping in. And System 2 might just nod along because, well, questioning that initial feeling takes effort. It feels easier not to.
Huh. So a key thing for us to realize is that we sometimes just default to the easier thought path, even if it's not the best one.
Precisely. It's the path of least resistance, mentally speaking.
Right. And that ties into System 1 being this associative machine. It's always connecting dots, right? Building stories.
Constantly. Even with very little to go on. System 1 is amazing at spotting patterns and creating a coherent narrative from, scraps of information.
Which sounds useful.
And it is hugely efficient for quick reactions, understanding social cues, things like that. But, and this is a big but, it's also really prone to jumping to conclusions. It doesn't naturally stop and think, maybe there's information I'm missing. It just sees a couple of pieces and assumes it knows the whole picture.
So we need to be aware of those instant judgments. Maybe pause and ask if we really have the full story.
That's the insight, yeah. Be mindful of that leap.
And when we make those leaps, we often feel pretty certain, don't we? That connects to cognitive ease, this idea that our brains just prefer easy.
Absolutely. Information that's clear, familiar, even just presented nicely. System 1 processes it smoothly, effortlessly.
Yeah, that easy feeling.
We mistake it for truth or validity. If something feels easy to grasp, we're just more likely to believe it's true, even without solid evidence.
Ah, the illusion of truth. Believing something just because it sounds familiar or simple.
Exactly. Maybe you've heard it before, maybe it's just phrased simply. That familiarity breeds acceptance.
Okay, so the takeaway there is maybe be a bit more suspicious of things that feel too easy.
A healthy dose of skepticism towards effortless understanding, yes. It might not be as solid as it feels.
So System 1 is cruising along on autopilot based on patterns, what feels easy. What happens when something breaks the pattern, something unexpected?
Ah, that's where norms, surprises, and engaging System 2 comes in. System 1 operates on expectations, what's normal in a given situation.
Right.
When something violates that expectation, something surprising happens, System 1 flags it. It's like a little mental alarm bell goes off.
And that wakes up System 2.
Often, yes. That surprise signal can trigger System 2 to pay attention, to engage more actively. Think about a sudden loud bang in a library.
Yeah, you definitely snap to attention.
Exactly. You stop what you're doing, focus. So surprises can actually be quite useful for kicking our more thoughtful system into gear.
Okay, so System 2 can be nudged awake, but even when we think we're using it, our minds can still trick us. Like this idea of answering an easier question.
Oh, this is fascinating. It's called attribute substitution. Basically, when you face a really tough, complex question, one that System 2 would have to really grind on,
Okay.
System 1 often subtly swaps it out. It substitutes a simpler, related question that it can answer easily, intuitively.
Without you realizing it.
Usually, yeah. For instance, if someone asks, how happy are you with your life overall?
Yeah.
That's a big complex.
Very.
Your System 1 might instantly substitute, how good is my mood right now? It answers that easier question, and you feel like you've answered the original one.
Wow. So your current mood could hijack your whole life satisfaction judgment.
It absolutely can. The insight is realizing our immediate feelings can sometimes stand in for much broader, more complex evaluations.
That really is an eye-opener. Okay, let's shift into part 2. This is all about heuristics and biases, these mental shortcuts that, well, they're often useful, but sometimes lead us astray.
Right. The common thinking traps.
First up, the law of small numbers. What's the core problem here? How does it trip us up?
The law of small numbers is basically our faulty assumption that small samples, like a few experiences or data points, should perfectly reflect the bigger picture, the whole population.
So seeing a couple of Teslas drive by and thinking suddenly everyone drives a Tesla.
Kind of, yeah. Or reading, say, 3 amazing reviews for a new cafe and just assuming it's the best place ever, period.
Even though it's just 3 people's opinions.
Exactly. You're overlooking that it's a tiny sample. This leads us to overgeneralize like crazy from limited personal experiences or anecdotes. We build a whole theory based on insufficient evidence.
So the takeaway is, be careful drawing big conclusions from small bits of information.
Definitely. Question the sample size, always.
Okay. And sticking with things that influence us, what about anchors? How can a random number just throw off our judgment so much?
Anchoring is incredibly powerful. An anchor is just an initial piece of information, often a number, but not always, that grabs hold of our thinking.
Even if it is totally irrelevant.
Even if it's completely arbitrary. Classic example is negotiation. The very first price mentioned, even if it's ridiculously high or low, becomes an anchor. All subsequent offers and counteroffers tend to cluster around that initial number. Your final agreement is often closer to that anchor than it would have been if it hadn't been mentioned.
Even if you know the anchor is silly.
Even then, conscious awareness doesn't fully break its pull. It's weird. So the practical advice is, be aware of that first number you encounter. Actively question if it's actually a reasonable starting point or just, well, an anchor.
Our brain just latches onto it. It's hard to shake. Okay, another big one, the science of availability. How does that shape how we see the world?
The availability heuristic is all about how easily examples come to mind. We tend to judge how likely or frequent something is based purely on how easy it is for us to recall instances of it.
So if we hear a lot about plane crashes on the news,
we might overestimate the actual risk of flying, even though statistically it's very safe, because those vivid, dramatic stories are highly available in our memory.
compared to, say, car crashes, which are way more common but less reported on individually.
Exactly. Media coverage, personal experiences, anything emotionally charged or vivid, it makes certain events stick in our minds, making them seem more common than they are.
So the key thing is that what's easily remembered isn't necessarily what's most probable.
That's the core of it. Don't confuse ease of recall with actual frequency.
And you mentioned emotion there, that availability is often really tied to feelings, right? The things that scare us or excite us stick better.
Oh, absolutely. Availability, emotion, and risk perception are totally intertwined. Events that trigger strong emotions or create really strong mental images have a much bigger impact on how we judge risk.
Like that one scary story about a shark attack makes you feel like sharks are everywhere.
Even though the statistical risk is tiny, that powerful emotional memory overrides the stats. It can lead to fear-driven decisions that aren't entirely rational.
So when assessing risk, try to step back from the emotion and look at the actual numbers.
That's the goal. Easier said than done sometimes, but yeah, look for the data beyond the feeling.
Okay. Kahneman also talks about how we categorize things. And the representativeness heuristic is key here. He uses the Tom W.'s specialty example. What's the main idea?
Representativeness is about judging probability based on resemblance. We assess how likely it is that something or someone belongs to a category based on how similar it seems to our stereotype or prototype of that category.
Rather than thinking about how common that category actually is.
Exactly. We ignore the base rates. In the Tom W. example, you get a description of someone who sounds exactly like your stereotype of, say, a librarian, quiet, organized, loves books.
Okay.
You might quickly assume he is librarian, but you forget to consider that there are vastly more, say, salespeople than librarians in the population overall. The description fits the stereotype, so we overweight that similarity and underweight the actual statistics.
So what looks typical isn't always what's most probable, statistically.
Precisely. Don't let stereotypes override the base rates.
And focusing on what seems representative can lead to actual logical errors, like the conjunction fallacy with the Linda problem. That one always feels so wrong intuitively.
It really messes with your intuition. The conjunction fallacy, shown in the Linda less is more idea, is when we think a more specific scenario is more probable than a general one it includes.
So like Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement.
Seems more likely to us than just Linda is a bank teller, even though logically for both things to be true, it has to be less probable than just one of them being true.
Right. The group of feminist bank tellers is smaller than the group of all bank tellers.
Mathematically, yes. But the detailed description feels more representative of Linda based on whatever description we were given. It makes a better story in our heads.
So, takeaway. Adding details doesn't make something more likely.
In fact, it mathematically makes it less likely. Our intuition gets fooled by the coherence of the story.
Our brains just love a good narrative, which also explains why causes trump statistics, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We are wired to look for causal explanations. Stories about why something happened feel much more satisfying, more convincing than just looking at cold, hard statistical facts.
Even if the stats are more reliable.
Often, yes. We might ignore base rates, how often things generally happen, if we hear a compelling anecdote or a plausible-sounding causal story.
So be careful not to get too swept away by a good story. Always check the underlying numbers.
That's the practical advice. Don't let narrative completely overshadow statistical reality.
Okay, last one in this section. Regression to the mean. Sounds technical, but it affects how we see everyday things, right?
Very much so. Regression to the mean is just a statistical fact. Extreme results tend to be followed by results closer to the average.
So if an athlete has an absolutely amazing game, their next game is likely to be less amazing, closer to their normal performance.
Probably, yeah. Or if a student bombs a test, they're likely to do better, closer to their average, next time, even if nothing specific changes.
But we tend to think something caused the change, don't we?
We do. We mistakenly attribute these natural fluctuations to things we did, like, oh, I praised them after the great game, that's why they did worse, or I yelled at them after the bad test, that's why they improved.
Well, it might just be statistics evening things out.
Exactly. It's just things moving back towards the average. The insight is to be cautious about assigning cause and effect when you might just be seeing statistical regression.
All right, moving into part 3. Kahneman tackles overconfidence. A big part of this is the illusion of understanding, which often shows up as hindsight bias, that I knew it all along feeling.
Oh yeah, hindsight bias is everywhere. After something happens, especially something significant, we look back and it suddenly seems obvious, predictable.
Like, of course that political candidate was going to win, or
Yeah.
I knew that stock would crash.
Exactly. We reconstruct the past to make it seem more orderly and foreseeable than it actually was at the time.
And that makes it
Overconfident in our ability to predict the future. It also leads to unfairly judging past decisions because we evaluate them based on the outcome we now know, not the information available then.
So, key takeaway. Remember that things almost always seem clearer looking back. Don't overestimate how predictable things were.
Try to recall the uncertainty you felt before the event happened.
Good point. And it's not just about the past. We also overestimate our current judgments. This illusion of validity. Even experts fall for this.
Yes, that's a really crucial finding. The illusion of validity is our tendency to feel more confident in our judgments and predictions than their actual accuracy justifies.
So feeling really sure about something doesn't mean you're actually right.
Not at all. Subjective confidence is a poor predictor of objective accuracy, even for experienced professionals in many fields. We can feel absolutely certain and still be completely wrong.
Which then leads to this surprising finding Kahneman discusses. Intuitions versus formulas. Sometimes simple algorithms beat human experts.
It sounds counterintuitive, right? But the research is pretty solid. In a surprising number of areas predicting things like medical diagnoses, loan risks, even success in job interviews, simple statistical formulas often outperform human experts relying on their intuition.
Why is that?
Because formulas apply rules consistently. They don't get tired or biased by irrelevant details or swayed by how confident they feel the way humans do.
So the practical insight is maybe we should trust data and algorithms more often, especially in predictable domains.
It suggests we should at least consider using them or using them as a check on our own judgment. Don't automatically assume human intuition is superior.
But Kahneman isn't saying expert intuition is useless, is he? There must be times when it's good.
No, definitely not useless. He clarifies expert intuition, when to trust it. Intuition can be highly valuable, but primarily in environments that are stable and predictable.
Okay.
And crucially, where the expert gets regular, clear, and rapid feedback on their judgments. Think of a firefighter knowing instinctively how a fire might behave, or a chess grandmaster seeing the board.
They've learned patterns through lots of practice and immediate feedback.
Exactly. But in highly uncertain, complex domains like, say, long-term political forecasting or stock picking where feedback is slow, noisy, or non-existent, expert intuition is much less reliable. It's prone to all the biases we've been talking about.
So expertise needs the right environment and feedback loop to be trustworthy.
That's a good way to put it. Domain matters.
Okay, so when making predictions, especially about complex things, it's important to take the outside view. What does that mean exactly?
The outside view means deliberately looking beyond the specifics of your current situation and considering the statistics of similar situations. It's about looking at the base rates.
Instead of just focusing on why your project or situation is unique and special, which is the inside view.
Precisely. The inside view focuses on the unique details of the case at hand, which often leads to optimistic bias. This time, it's different. The outside view forces you to ask, how often do projects like this succeed or fail in general?
Like, if you're starting a restaurant, don't just focus on your amazing recipes. Look at the failure rate for new restaurants.
Exactly. It provides a much-needed reality check based on historical data, counteracting our natural tendency towards over-optimism about our own specific case.
And speaking of optimism, Kahneman links overconfidence to the engine of capitalism, this sort of built-in optimism bias.
Yeah, he suggests that this tendency towards overconfidence and optimism, while often leading to flawed plans and failures, is also kind of essential for driving innovation and entrepreneurship. Believing your venture will succeed against the odds is often what gives people the motivation to take big risks.
So it's a double-edged sword. It fuels progress, but also causes a lot of failures.
Pretty much. It highlights the potential downside of unrealistic expectations fueled by bias, but also acknowledges its role as a motivator. The trick is balancing that optimism with a realistic assessment of the challenges.
Okay, let's pivot now to part 4, looking at how we actually make choices. And as Kahneman shows, it's often not the purely logical process we might think. This brings us to prospect theory, and especially loss aversion.
Right. Prospect theory, which Kahneman developed with Amos Tversky, was groundbreaking. It changed how we think about decisions involving risk, and a huge piece of it is loss aversion.
Which is?
Basically, we feel the pain of a loss much more intensely, maybe twice as intensely, as we feel the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
So losing $100 feels way worse than finding $100 feels good.
Exactly. That psychological asymmetry has a massive impact on our choices. We're often driven more by the desire to avoid losses than by the desire to achieve gains.
And that ties into the endowment effect, right? This odd thing where we value stuff more just because it's ours.
Precisely. The endowment effect flows directly from loss aversion. Once something is part of our endowment, part of what we own, giving it up feels like a loss.
And since losses loom larger than gains,
we demand a higher price to sell something we own than we'd be willing to pay to acquire the exact same thing if we didn't own it. Ownership itself seems to add value in our minds because losing it hurts.
that explains why it's so hard to sell that old junk in the garage. It feels more valuable because it's mine.
That's the endowment effect at work.
And our choices aren't just about gains and losses, but how they're presented to us. The power of framing effects.
Huge. Framing effects show that you can get people to make different choices based purely on how you describe the options, even if the underlying facts are identical.
Like the classic example, a surgery with a 90% survival rate versus one with a 10% mortality rate.
same outcome, totally different psychological impact. People are much more likely to choose the option framed in terms of gains, survival, than the identical option framed in terms of losses, mortality.
Because that mortality frame hits our loss aversion button hard.
Exactly. It highlights how easily our preferences can be manipulated just by changing the language used, so always be aware of how choices are being framed for you.
Okay, finally, part 5 brings in this really deep idea. The two selves. The experiencing self versus the remembering self. This seems like it changes how we should think about happiness and memory.
It's a profound distinction, yeah. The experiencing self is you in the present moment. It's what feels pleasure, pain, boredom, engagement, second by second.
Living life as it happens.
Right. The remembering self is different. It's the storyteller. It looks back, evaluates experiences, constructs memories, and makes judgments about whether something was good or bad overall.
And these two selves don't always agree.
They often have very different perspectives. What the experiencing self goes through isn't always what the remembering self, well, remembers or values most.
And the remembering self seems to dominate our thinking about the past. And he uses shortcuts, like the peak end rule.
Totally. Kahneman talks about life as a story, and it's the remembering self writing that story. And crucially, it doesn't give equal weight to all moments.
It focuses on
The peak end rule. The remembering self heavily weights 2 moments when judging an entire experience. The most intense point, the peak, whether good or bad, and the very end.
and the duration, how long the experience lasted.
Often gets almost completely ignored. A short, intensely pleasant experience with a good ending might be remembered more fondly than a longer, mildly pleasant one.
Wow. So our memories of events are really skewed summaries, not accurate recordings.
Pretty much. They're highlights reels edited by the peak end rule. This massively affects how we evaluate our past and what future experiences we seek out. What you remember isn't necessarily what you lived.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground from thinking fast and slow. If you had to boil it down, what's the single biggest takeaway?
I think the core idea is just recognizing these 2 systems exist within you. System 1, the fast, intuitive, often biased one, and System 2, the slow, effortful, analytical one. Just knowing they operate differently and that System 1 often takes shortcuts that lead to predictable errors. That awareness is huge.
That's the first step.
It's the crucial first step to understanding why you think and act the way you do, and maybe catching some of those biases in action.
And for you listening, what's the real practical value here? Why should you care about System 1 and System 2?
Well, becoming more aware of how these systems work and the common biases they generate, it really empowers you. It's not about magically eliminating bias. That's probably impossible.
Right.
But it is about recognizing it, understanding it. That allows you to be more mindful, to question your gut feelings sometimes, to make more informed decisions, and hopefully avoid some common thinking traps. It leads to clearer, more intentional thinking.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening.
Yeah.
Think about a decision you made recently. Could be big, could be small. Try to ask yourself, which system felt like it was mostly in charge? Was it a quick, intuitive System 1 call? Or did you deliberately engage System 2?
And could any of the things we talked about, availability, loss aversion, anchoring, maybe just System 2 being a bit lazy, could any of those have nudged your decision one way or another?
Just noticing, right? That awareness, as Kahneman's work really drives home, that's the start of thinking better. And hey, we've really only skimmed the surface today.
It's a rich book.
It absolutely is. So if this deep dive got you thinking, I definitely encourage you to pick up Thinking Fast and Slow itself. There's so much more there.